Shaq was just enjoying his meal when a sneering waiter yanked a plate away from a homeless man. "The food's not free, buddy. Get out." The diner went silent. Eyes darted, whispers spread, but no one spoke up. No one dared to challenge him. Shaq's jaw tightened. He wiped his mouth, stood up, and locked eyes with the waiter. What happened next didn't just change one life. It started a movement. Stay till the end because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Shaq took a slow, deep breath, setting his fork down as his eyes locked onto the scene unfolding across the diner. The homeless man, his clothes worn and tattered, blinked in confusion, staring at the now empty space where his meal had been just moments ago. His frail fingers twitched, as if his body couldn't decide whether to fight for his food or accept yet another cruel rejection. The waiter, a smug-looking man with a crisp uniform and an arrogant smirk, held the stolen plate in one hand, standing tall like he'd just done something noble. "I said, get out," he repeated, his tone sharp, dismissive. The diner fell into an uneasy silence. Some customers glanced away, suddenly finding their coffee cups or menus extremely interesting. Others shifted uncomfortably in their booths but said nothing. No one spoke up. No one challenged what had just happened. The homeless man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he hesitated. His lips parted, maybe to plead, maybe to argue, but the words never came. Instead, his shoulders sagged in defeat. He pushed his chair back with an agonizing slowness, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table for support. Shaq clenched his jaw, muscles in his forearm tightening as he watched the man shrink under the weight of his humiliation. The man wasn't just hungry, he was broken. How many times had he been treated like this before? How many times had the world made him feel invisible, unworthy? The soft shuffle of the man's feet against the floor sent a fresh wave of anger through Shaq's chest. Enough. Before the man could take another step toward the exit, Shaq pushed his chair back with a deliberate scrape. The sound cut through the silence like a gunshot. The homeless man froze. The waiter's smirk faltered. Shaq stood to his full 7 feet, 1 inch height, his towering presence impossible to ignore. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. "Where are you going, big man?" Shaq's deep voice rumbled through the diner, steady and controlled, but laced with undeniable authority. The homeless man hesitated, looking up at Shaq, uncertainty flickering in his weary eyes. The waiter scoffed, rolling his eyes. "What, you got a problem, buddy?" Shaq's gaze, sharp as steel, locked onto the waiter. "Yeah," Shaq said, his voice even, but dangerous. "I do." The tension in the diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every eye in the room locked onto Shaq as he took slow, deliberate steps toward the waiter, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the tiled floor. The homeless man hesitated mid-step, his hollow eyes darting between Shaq and the exit, unsure whether to keep moving or stay. "Where do you think you're going?" Shaq's voice, steady but commanding, filled the diner. The homeless man swallowed hard, his shoulders hunched as if expecting to be told to leave again. "I don't want trouble," he murmured. Shaq shook his head. "Nah, man. You were sitting right there, minding your business. That was your food. You don't just let someone take what's yours." The homeless man glanced at the plate still in the waiter's hand, his fingers twitching at his sides. The waiter scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Look, big guy, this isn't a soup kitchen," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We got paying customers here." Shaq's eyebrow arched. "And?" He took another step forward, closing the space between them. "That meal was already served to him. You don't get to decide who eats and who doesn't." The waiter smirked. "Well, actually, I do. House rules. If he can't pay, he can't eat." A low murmur rippled through the diner. A couple sitting at a nearby booth exchanged uneasy glances. A young mother pulled her child closer. Even the manager, who had been pretending not to notice the confrontation, shifted uncomfortably near the cash register. Shaq studied the waiter, his sharp gaze unwavering. Then he turned to the homeless man. "You hungry?" The man's face burned with embarrassment. He hesitated before nodding once. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. The moment his fingers brushed against the leather, the diner collectively held its breath, unsure of what was coming next. Then, he did something no one expected. With a flick of his wrist, Shaq didn't just pull out a 20 or even a 50. Instead, he peeled off a crisp $100 bill and slapped it onto the counter in front of the waiter. The sound echoed through the silent room like a judge's gavel. There, that should cover his meal, Shaq said, his voice even. In fact, let's make it easy. However much he eats today, it's on me. The waiter stared at the bill, then smirked and pushed it back toward Shaq. You think you can just throw money around? This isn't about cash. It's about who belongs here. The tension in the diner had reached a breaking point. The sound of Shaq's $100 bill hitting the counter echoed through the room, yet the waiter didn't even glance at it. Instead, he chuckled, a smug, dismissive laugh that sent a cold ripple through the air. You think you can just throw money around and fix everything? The waiter sneered, crossing his arms. This ain't about money, big guy. It's about who belongs here. The entire diner seemed to shrink into silence. Even the faint clinking of silverware stopped as customers sat frozen in their seats, eyes darting between Shaq and the arrogant waiter. The manager, who had been pretending not to notice, suddenly looked pale. Shaq's jaw tensed. He had dealt with ignorance before. But this was something different. Say that again, Shaq said, his voice quieter now, but somehow more dangerous. The homeless man, still standing beside him, lowered his head further, as if trying to disappear. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, gripping the frayed fabric of his coat. His face burned with shame. People in the diner exchanged uneasy glances. A woman near the window whispered something to her husband. A man in a business suit shifted uncomfortably in his chair. No one spoke up. No one intervened. The waiter smirked, enjoying the power he thought he had. I don't serve his kind, he said, shrugging as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Shaq exhaled slowly, his fists curled at his sides. For a moment, he just stared at the waiter, studying him like a chess player considering his next move. This your restaurant? Shaq finally asked, his voice eerily calm. The waiter blinked, confused. What? Shaq took a step closer, towering over him. Do you own this place? The waiter scoffed, shaking his head. No, but did you pay for the food in this kitchen? The waiter hesitated. That's not. Then why? Shaq cut him off, voice steady but sharp. Do you think you get to decide who eats and who doesn't? The smirk on the waiter's face faltered for the first time. The confidence in his stance wavered. He looked around as if searching for backup, but no one in the diner came to his defense. Shaq leaned in slightly, his deep voice dropping to a low rumble. Let me tell you something about who belongs here. The door to the kitchen swung open, and a stern voice cut through the silence. What the hell is going on out here? The owner had just arrived. The diner was so silent you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Every pair of eyes was locked on Shaq, who stood tall, his massive frame radiating calm authority. The waiter, Tony, had just crossed a line, one he couldn't take back. Instead of arguing, Shaq slowly reached down and picked up the $100 bill from the table. He tucked it back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. Tony smirked, mistaking the move for retreat. That's what I thought, he muttered under his breath. Shaq didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he pulled out his phone and, without hesitation, tapped a number and put it on speaker. The manager, a short, nervous-looking man in a wrinkled button-up, came rushing forward, sensing things were escalating. Look, sir, let's not make a scene. We can comp the meal. No need for any trouble. His voice was tight, strained. Shaq held up a massive hand, silencing him without a word. The phone rang once, twice. Then a deep, commanding voice answered. Yeah, Shaq? What's up? A few customers gasped. They recognized that voice. Shaq smirked, his eyes never leaving Tony's. You still own that chain of diners? Tony's cocky expression crumbled instantly. His face went pale as his mouth opened, then shut again, like he was struggling to process what was happening. The voice on the other end of the line chuckled. Last I checked, yeah. Why? Shaq leaned on the counter, his voice casual, but everyone could hear the edge beneath it. I'm standing in one of your places right now, and there's a problem. The entire diner sat in stunned silence. The manager swallowed hard, suddenly looking as pale as Tony. The owner's tone shifted. What kind of problem? Shaq turned his gaze toward Tony, who was now frozen in place, his hands gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping him standing. A little issue with customer service, Shaq said smoothly. Seems like your guy Tony here thinks he gets to decide who eats and who doesn't. The line went silent for a moment. Then the voice came back, sharper now. Tony? Tony flinched at the sound of his name. He took a stumbling step backward. I was just following policy, man. Shaq cut him off. Oh, don't worry. I think Tony here just quit. The owner's voice came back, firm and final. Put me on speaker. I want everyone to hear this. The color drained from Tony's face. His once smug expression twisted into something unreadable. Panic, disbelief, maybe even regret. But it was too late for all that now. The manager, who had been nervously watching things unfold, took a step closer, his voice shaking. Wait, we can fix this. Shaq didn't even glance at him. His focus was on the homeless man, who still stood by the door, unsure whether to stay or go. Shaq gestured toward the counter. Order whatever you want. On me. The homeless man blinked, stunned. I don't want to cause trouble. Shaq smiled. Trouble's already here, big man. Might as well eat. The tension in the diner was thick, but the moment Shaq said that, something shifted. Customers who had been silent, just watching, now started murmuring to one another. A few pulled out their phones, recording the moment. Tony, still trying to salvage his pride, scoffed. This is ridiculous. What, you think just because you're famous, you can come in here and make the rules? Shaq turned his full attention to him, towering over the trembling waiter. Number, but I do think basic human decency should be the rule. The homeless man hesitated, then finally walked back toward the counter. The waitress from earlier, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation, stepped forward, this time without hesitation. What would you like, sir? She asked softly. For a long moment, the man didn't answer. Then, as if allowing himself to believe it was real, he finally said, a cheeseburger, and fries, and maybe a milkshake? Shaq grinned. Make it two. I'll eat with you. The entire diner erupted into whispers. Someone in the back gasped, this is going to go viral. Tony looked around wildly, realizing the cameras were already pointed at him. His reputation, his job, everything was crumbling right in front of him. Then the booming voice from Shaq's phone cut through the noise. Shaq, put me on speaker. Shaq smirked. Gladly. He tapped the button. The owner's voice filled the entire restaurant, sharp and commanding. I want everyone to hear this. Tony swallowed hard. He already knew this wasn't going to end well for him. The diner was dead silent, every set of eyes locked on the phone in Shaq's massive hand. Tony, the waiter, stood frozen, his face pale as the owner's booming voice filled the room. I've run this business for 20 years, the voice growled, and I will not tolerate this. Tony licked his lips, his bravado crumbling. He forced a weak chuckle. Look, I was just following policy. The owner didn't even let him finish. Funny, because our policy is to serve every customer with respect. A ripple of murmurs spread through the diner. Customers nodded in agreement, some glaring at Tony. The waitress from earlier shifted uncomfortably but looked relieved. Even the manager, who had stood awkwardly on the sidelines, suddenly looked like he wanted to distance himself from the waiter. Shaq folded his arms, tilting his head. So, what's it gonna be? His voice was calm, but the weight behind it sent an unmistakable message. There was no walking away from this. The phone crackled as the owner let out a deep sigh. Then, without hesitation, he said the words that sealed Tony's fate. Tony, you're fired, and don't bother asking for a reference. The entire diner seemed to exhale at once. Then a slow clap started from the corner booth. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause. Tony's jaw dropped. Wait, what? You heard me, the owner snapped. You think you can decide who eats and who doesn't? Not in my restaurant. Now get out. Tony's face twisted in anger. You can't just fire me like this in front of... Shaq cut him off with a smirk. Oh, I think he just did. The now former waiter's hands clenched into fists, his eyes darting around as if searching for support. But there was none. Even the manager, realizing the tide had turned, took a step back. Tony let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. No, what's ridiculous, Shaq said, stepping closer, is treating someone like trash just because they're down on their luck. Tony scoffed but didn't argue. Instead, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the exit. As he pushed the door open, someone from the crowd called out, "Don't let the door hit you on the way out." Laughter followed as the door slammed shut behind him. The tension in the diner finally eased, replaced by an electric energy. The homeless man, David, looked overwhelmed, staring down at his untouched plate of food. Then the manager hesitantly cleared his throat and turned to Shaq. Sir, is there anything else we can do? Shaq rubbed his chin, pretending to think. Then his eyes lit up. Yeah, actually, there is. The entire room leaned in, waiting to hear what he had in mind. The diner, still buzzing from what had just unfolded, fell into a curious silence as all eyes shifted toward Shaq. The massive man stood with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the homeless man, David, who was still seated at the corner table, staring down at the untouched meal in front of him. "You got a name?" Shaq's deep voice cut through the quiet like a knife. David blinked, almost as if he wasn't sure Shaq was talking to him. He cleared his throat, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Uh, David." Shaq nodded, a small grin playing on his lips. "David. Good name." He leaned down slightly, his massive frame making the booth seem even smaller. "Tell me something, man. How would you like a fresh start?" David's eyes widened, confusion flashing across his face. "What do you mean?" Shaq turned toward the diner's manager, who still looked shaken from the whole ordeal. "You said you needed a new employee, right?" The manager hesitated, glancing at David, then back at Shaq. "Uh, yeah, actually. We've been short-staffed for weeks." Shaq smirked. "Well, I think you just found yourself a new hire." David's head snapped up so fast it was a wonder he didn't hurt his neck. "Me?" He let out a nervous chuckle, shaking his head. I, I don't even have a place to stay. I don't have clean clothes. I don't—" His voice trailed off, his shoulders slumping. Shaq's expression softened. "One step at a time, big man." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills. The room collectively held its breath as Shaq casually slid the money across the table. "Consider this your first paycheck." A gasp rippled through the diner. The manager's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, completely speechless. David's hands trembled as he stared at the cash. I can't take this." Shaq shrugged. "Sure, you can. And you will." David swallowed hard, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Why would you do this for me?" Shaq let out a deep chuckle. "Because everyone deserves a chance, man. And I got a feeling you won't waste yours." The moment felt almost surreal. Customers watched in awe, their phones still recording, capturing not just an act of generosity, but a man's entire life changing before their eyes. The manager finally snapped out of his daze, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, I guess we better get you a uniform." David let out a shaky laugh. I don't even know what to say." Shaq patted his shoulder. "Just say you'll show up." David nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll show up." The room erupted into applause, but just as the moment settled, the diner door swung open. Someone else had just walked in, and their expression made it clear that things weren't over yet. The diner buzzed with an energy David had never felt before, at least not in a long time. Just moments ago, he had been humiliated, cast out like he didn't belong. But now, he stood behind the counter, his hands gripping the straps of a brand new apron, his heart pounding in disbelief. The moment felt surreal. He ran his fingers over the crisp fabric, almost expecting to wake up from what had to be a dream. "You got this, man!" Someone called from the crowd of customers still gathered around. A few clapped, others gave him encouraging nods. David swallowed hard and nodded back, even though his nerves screamed at him that he didn't belong here, that any second now someone would tell him it was a mistake. But then a massive hand landed on his shoulder. "Shaq, you ever worked in a restaurant before?" Shaq asked, his deep voice light with amusement. David let out a nervous chuckle. Not exactly." Shaq smirked. "Good, that makes two of us." David blinked. "Wait, what?" Shaq leaned against the counter. "Yeah, man, I worked at a fast food joint back in the day. Thought it'd be easy. Flipping burgers, taking orders. I was terrible at it." David couldn't help it. He laughed. The idea of a 7'1" basketball legend fumbling with a tray of food was too much. Shaq grinned. "Swear on it. I dropped so many milkshakes they started calling me Big Spill." The whole diner chuckled, the tension lifting. The manager, still a little overwhelmed from everything that had just happened, handed David a notepad. "All right, first things first. Let's start you off easy. Just take drink orders for now." David took the pad hesitantly. His hand still trembled slightly, but he nodded. "Okay, I can do that." He stepped out from behind the counter, and for the first time in forever, people weren't looking at him with pity. They weren't whispering about how he shouldn't be here. "Excuse me?" A woman at the nearest booth smiled at him. "I'll take a coffee, please, black." David clicked his pen, writing it down. "Got it." A man next to her grinned. "And I'll take a milkshake, but don't pull a big spill on me." Laughter rippled through the diner, and David smiled. Actually smiled. Shaq watched from the side, arms crossed, nodding in approval. David had come in that day expecting nothing but rejection. But now, he had a job, a chance, and for the first time in years, hope. The next morning, the world had already changed. David had just finished his first real shift at the diner, wiping down tables, greeting customers, and, for the first time in years, feeling like he belonged. But outside the walls of that little restaurant, something much bigger was happening, because someone had filmed everything. The moment Shaq had stood up for David, the confrontation with the waiter, the powerful phone call that got the man fired, it had all been recorded. And by the time the sun came up, the video had exploded across social media. 10 million views. News outlets picked it up instantly. Twitter was flooded with reactions. Shaq is a real-life superhero. This is what kindness looks like. If I ever see Shaq in public, I'm paying for his meal. Celebrities jumped in. Athletes, actors, influencers. Everyone had something to say. Even major brands chimed in, offering David free meals, clothes, and even job opportunities. David didn't even have a phone of his own to see it happen. He only found out when a customer came in, eyes wide, and asked, "Hey man, how's it feel to be famous?" David had just finished cleaning a booth. "Famous?" He laughed awkwardly. "I think you got the wrong guy." The customer grinned and turned his phone screen toward him. David's stomach dropped. There he was, his face, his story, everywhere. The clip of him sitting at that table, humiliated. The moment Shaq stepped in, the roar of applause when Shaq put the cruel waiter in his place. The video had captions. When one man stood up, the world took notice. David felt his throat tighten. The world was watching this? Meanwhile, the former waiter, Tony, had his own reaction. He tried to fight back online, claiming it was all taken out of context. "I was just following policy. People don't understand what it's like to work in the service industry. Shaq made me lose my job over some homeless guy." But it didn't work. The internet wasn't buying it. People dug into his past, uncovering years of complaints from customers. Rude behavior, refused service. This wasn't his first offense. Tony had thought he could play the victim. Instead, he had just sealed his own fate. And while he was busy spiraling, Shaq's phone rang. The number was unknown. But when Shaq answered, the voice on the other end made him sit up straight. This was bigger than he thought. The phone call wasn't from a news anchor, a fan, or even a celebrity reaching out to congratulate Shaq. It was bigger. "Shaq," the voice on the other end said, serious but excited. "We need to talk." Shaq leaned back in his chair, recognizing the voice instantly. It was the owner of the entire diner chain. "I saw the video, man. The way you handled that situation? Incredible," the owner continued. "I won't lie. I had no idea something like that was happening in one of my restaurants, but it got me thinking." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Thinking about what?" The owner hesitated for just a second, then said, "David isn't the only one. There are thousands of people out there, just like him, who need a second chance. And I've got locations across the country. What if we did something bigger?" Shaq sat up. Now this was interesting. "I like where this is going," he said, intrigued. "Keep talking." The owner continued, "Right now there are empty positions in almost every restaurant I own. What if—" He paused as if the idea was still forming in his mind. "What if we started hiring people who really needed the work? People who've been turned away, ignored, forgotten?" Shaq could already see it. "You're talking about a full-scale hiring initiative, prioritizing people in need." "Exactly," the owner confirmed. "Homeless individuals, veterans struggling to get back on their feet, single parents who just need a break, people who want to work but never get the chance." Shaq was quiet for a moment, letting the weight of the idea settle. "Look," the owner said, filling the silence. "You inspired something here, Shaq. I want to run with it. But I don't just want it to be another corporate program that looks good on paper. I want you involved. You make people listen. You make things happen." Shaq exhaled, tapping his fingers against the table. He wasn't just some retired athlete looking to throw money at a problem. He had always believed in action. And now he had the opportunity to take one good deed and turn it into something massive. "I'm in," he said without hesitation. The owner let out a relieved chuckle. "I was hoping you'd say that." Shaq leaned forward, already in business mode. "All right, so what's the plan? How do we actually make this happen?" The owner's response made Shaq's eyes widen. This wasn't just about one restaurant. This was about to go national. Shaq had been a part of big things before. NBA championships, million-dollar business deals, even blockbuster movies. But this felt different. He sat in front of his phone, staring at the post he was about to make. The restaurant owner had just given him the final green light. The hiring initiative was officially rolling out nationwide. A few keystrokes, a deep breath. Then he hit post. One meal changed a life. Let's change thousands. If you're looking for a fresh start, we got jobs waiting. No more second chances. This is your first real one. Let's make this bigger than me. Second chance hires. Within seconds, the numbers started climbing. 1,000 likes, 10,000, 50,000. The comment section exploded. Wait, this is real? Where can I apply? Shaq is the hero we didn't know we needed. I've been looking for a job for months. I'm showing up tomorrow. This could save so many lives. It wasn't just regular people responding. Celebrities started sharing it. News outlets picked it up. Even business moguls weighed in. Shaq is changing the game again. This is how you use your platform. Mark Cuban. Respect. If you're hiring, I want in. Let's do this together. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. People talk about change. Shaq is doing it. Oprah Winfrey. Within hours, the campaign was trending worldwide. But what Shaq wasn't expecting? The flood of job applications. Every single restaurant in the owner's chain was swamped. Phone lines jammed. Managers scrambled to process walk-ins. In one night, over 10,000 applications had come in. By the next morning, 100,000. And it wasn't just the owner's restaurants anymore. Other businesses started joining in. Coffee shops, fast food chains, hotels, retail stores. Everyone wanted in. The second chance hiring movement had officially begun. But for every excited applicant, there were skeptics. News anchors debated it. Are these businesses really hiring for the right reasons? Some CEOs dismissed it. It's just a publicity stunt. And of course, the former waiter, Tony, was all over social media, trying to flip the narrative. This is ridiculous, Tony ranted in a now viral video. I lost my job over one mistake. How is that fair? Now we're just handing out jobs to people who didn't even work for them. Shaq saw the clip. Instead of responding with anger, he just smiled. He picked up his phone, hit record, and said, Tony, my guy. Second chances go to the ones who admit they messed up and want to do better. You still blaming everyone else? That's why you're on the outside looking in. The internet exploded. But just as the momentum was hitting its peak, Shaq's phone buzzed. A call from the White House. This was about to get even bigger. The restaurant buzzed with energy, the scent of sizzling burgers and fresh coffee filling the air. But today, the real story wasn't about the food. It was about the man behind the counter. David moved with confidence now, greeting customers with a smile, punching in orders like he'd been doing it his whole life. Only a few weeks ago, he had been just another face on the streets, invisible to most, treated like a burden, but not anymore. Now, he was somebody, and it all started with one meal. Shaq walked into the diner, his towering frame impossible to miss. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd. People still weren't used to a global icon casually strolling into a local restaurant. But David, he didn't hesitate. Shaq, he called out, grinning. Back for that burger? Shaq chuckled. You already know. David snapped his fingers, signaling the kitchen. One Shaq special coming up. The confidence in his voice wasn't just from working here. It was from belonging here. From knowing that he wasn't just another customer being thrown out, another forgotten soul scraping by. Shaq slid into his usual booth, and David, wiping his hands on a towel, sat across from him. You good? Shaq asked, eyeing him. David exhaled. Better than I've been in years, man. He leaned back, shaking his head. You ever just stop and wonder, how the hell did I get here? Shaq smirked. All the time. David drummed his fingers on the table. A month ago, I was just trying to make it through another night. Sleeping in doorways, hoping nobody messed with me. Now, I got a job, an apartment, even a little money saved. His voice thickened with emotion. Feels unreal. Shaq nodded. Nah, man, it's real. You made it real. David laughed. Come on, man. We both know I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Who's been clocking in every day? Who's been putting in the work? Ain't me. David hesitated, then grinned. Fair point. Then, as if remembering something, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $1 bill. Shaq tilted his head. What's that? David smoothed it out on the table. First dollar I ever made here. First real paycheck in years. He exhaled. That day, when you stood up for me, I swore I'd never forget where I started. Shaq studied the bill for a moment. Then without a word, he pulled out his own wallet. He took out a crisp, new $1 bill and slid it across the table. David frowned. What's this? Shaq smirked. Insurance. David picked it up, confused. Insurance for what? Shaq leaned in, voice low but firm. Because it ain't just about where you started. It's about where you're going. David stared at the bill, realization sinking in. He swallowed hard, nodding. I won't forget. Shaq sat back, grinning. Bet on it. What started as one act of kindness had turned into something bigger than anyone expected. Across the country, businesses were joining the movement. 50,000 plus job offers in the first month. Millions raised for homeless and at-risk individuals. The world had taken notice. And David? He wasn't just part of the movement. He was proof that it worked. One meal, one chance, one life changed. David kept that $1 bill in his wallet for the rest of his life. A reminder that all it took was one chance to turn everything around. And for thousands of others, that chance was just beginning.